Hey guys, and welcome back to Monka, where stuff ensues, but yesterday I beat a game, and so I kind of want to talk about it because it concludes a trilogy of games, and I have thoughts about it, and I don't think they're very popular, but the game I beat yesterday was Crysis 3, specifically the Nintendo Switch version, which is the remastered version that they released in 2021. Crysis 3 is developed and published by Crytek. As far as I know, it came out in 2013 originally for PC, PS3, and Xbox 360, and in 2021 came to PC, PS4, Xbox One, and of course the Nintendo Switch. The game in total took me 5.5 hours, making it the shortest out of the Crysis trilogy that it took me to beat. It took me around 7 to 8 hours to beat the first game, 7 hours to beat the second game, and this one just took 5.5 hours, so it is a really short game. But the long and short of my opinion on Crysis 3 is, honestly, it's pretty underwhelming and pretty disappointing, to be honest. This one out of the three is probably the worst in my opinion. It does try to do some things better over 2, but overall I think it just falls short, and honestly it feels like it was rushed, to be honest, which is disappointing because there are glimpses of something that could have been better in this game, but overall in my opinion it just fell flat and I was really underwhelmed by it. But in terms of the graphics and performance, this is the highest mark for Crysis 3, at least on the Nintendo Switch, because Crysis 3 is probably one of the most beautiful games on the Switch, bar none. It is an amazing looking game. Like I've said previously in previous videos, I really don't give a shit about graphics, but I have to give credit where credit's due, and credit is definitely due for Crysis 3 because it looks absolutely beautiful on the Nintendo Switch. The graphics are just amazing, and like I said, as far as I know, this is probably the best looking Switch game that I've ever seen. And to complement that, the game also runs really well. It has a stable frame rate that I think is 30 FPS, and it runs like that throughout the entire game with no hits to the performance. So not only is it a beautiful looking game, it performs flawlessly. But in terms of the graphics and performance, this is the highest mark for Crysis 3 in my opinion. Especially on the Switch, it just looks beautiful and runs amazing. But in terms of music, voice actors, and sound design, music really isn't anything that I remember all that well, but it was pretty decent, to be honest. It is mostly background, it's not gonna be like shit that jumps out at you like some soundtracks, but it's pretty orchestral with a strong focus on brass, as I can recall, and really just helps with tense moments. During intense fights or like a boss battle, it helps to amp up like the kind of tension that you feel during it, which is appreciated and is pretty cool. But the music other than that really doesn't stand out in my opinion. Overall it is decent though, but the voice actors are also pretty good in this game, to be honest. The main two characters, Psycho and Prophet, are voice acted pretty well. They also have their emotional moments where I feel like they project their characters pretty well, so the voice actors are pretty decent, to be honest, especially Psycho and Prophet's voice actors. Other than that, the side characters have a decent voice acting, but are nothing crazy honestly, but they do their part. Now in terms of the sound design, there isn't a whole hell of a lot of an upgrade over Crysis 2 in my opinion. There may be some subtle changes here and there. The guns sound, I think, maybe it's just placebo, but I think they sound a bit better in this game. They do have mostly the same weapons from Crysis 2, so I do think they sound better in Crysis 3 than in Crysis 2, but that, like I said, that just might be placebo. Otherwise, the firearms still sound punchy and are a lot better than they were in the original Crysis, and they make gunplay more satisfied due to the fact that they sound better, and as well the suppressed versions do sound better in this game than they do in the original Crysis. But other than that, the game has good sound design overall. Things just sound good in general. The ambiance sounds good as well. The only real complaint I have about sound design is the fact that the game has a bug with the sound design. I don't know if that's exclusive to the Nintendo Switch version, but I would notice that sometimes the audio would just cut out, whether it was gunshots or commentary throughout the game. The sound would just cut out like completely, except for like the ambiance track and the music. So sometimes the gunshots would just cut out, or the voice actors would just cut out mid-line, and the only way to alleviate that would be reloading a checkpoint. This is actually a huge annoyance for me, and this actually drags the game down quite a bit, because there would be points where I would just hear my gun cut out when it was shooting, and I would go, oh great, well whatever voice acting there was past that point is going to be cut out, because once the gunshots cut out, all the voice acting in the game cut out and all the lines cut out. So that was a huge annoyance. I don't know if that was just exclusive to the Nintendo Switch version, but it is worth noting. It kind of ruined the experience a little bit for me, and that's not the reason why I'd say it's underwhelming, because there were a slew of other things that made this game kind of annoying, but that bug, to say the very least, had a very substantial impact on the game in my opinion. But overall, in terms of sound, everything, music, voice acting, sound design, it's all pretty decent, to be honest. Like I said though, that sound glitch, I don't know if it's exclusive to the Nintendo Switch version, but that's a major bug, and it should have been patched out, but it is still on the game, and the game's been out for like a year and a half now. But in terms of the story and characters, this is kind of where where the game starts to fall short again. The story is awfully confusing, and they make it really fucking confusing, and the game hurts for it as well. Now, the story overall is that the game takes place 24 years after Crysis 2, so the game takes place in 2047. The confusing part of the game is the fact that Prophet is back for Crysis 3. Now, the ending of Crysis 2 is a bit convoluted, to be honest, because a bit of a spoiler territory, but if you're watching this video, then you probably know some of Crysis 2, but Prophet domes himself in the beginning of Crysis 2 so that Alcatraz, the new protagonist in Crysis 2, could fully merge with the nanosuit. Now, by the end of Crysis 2, Alcatraz, I guess, loses himself at some point, or loses his, sense of consciousness and becomes Prophet again. So in all technicality, Prophet never really dies because his consciousness is in the suit. And eventually his consciousness just takes over Alcatraz and Prophet returns at the end of Crysis 2. It's convoluted and confusing, and honestly it's just weird, but that's how it ends in Crysis 2, and that story picks up the same in Crysis 3. But Prophet retakes over as the protagonist in Crysis 3. As we discover him in Crysis 3, though, he is pretty much in some sort of deep slumber captured by Cell, the antagonists of Crysis 2. Now, Cell have taken credit essentially for defeating the aliens in New York City, and they gain a lot of influence politically and in the world stage. Due to this, at some point, and it's not really explained very well, but they capture Prophet and he becomes kind of isolated and trapped in this kind of deep slumber. Now, a rebel group breaks him out, and one of the rebels in this group is Psycho, the character from Crysis 1 that was also in a nanosuit, except this time around he's not in a nanosuit as he was stripped of his nanosuit by Cell. From this point forward, Psycho and Prophet's objective is to stop Cell due to the fact that Prophet has these visions where he sees something called the Alpha Ceph. Now, what the Alpha Ceph is essentially like the super alien that leads all the other aliens, and in his vision he pretty much sees the end of the world happening because of this Alpha Ceph. Now, Prophet, as he sees it, Cell is pretty much leading the end of the world and the return of Alpha Ceph, so he pretty much joins up with Psycho to take down Cell and to defeat the Alpha Ceph, and to pretty much prevent the end of humanity. I won't lie, the story is crazy convoluted and confusing just because the story beats that it follows are just so weird, and it goes so hard in the paint with this weird sci-fi narrative that it just makes the story overall confusing. The story as well is really not that satisfying because it feels like it's rushed, and that's really part due to the fact that the game is so short. The story kind of feels like it's rushed, and it makes it feel like those emotional moments that the game tries to have, it makes them feel like they fall flat because the characters just don't get enough development for those points to hit. But the story is just confusing. The story in Crysis 2 was kind of confusing, but in Crysis 3 it's way more confusing, and it just kind of ends on an unsatisfying note, really. The ending does conclude the Crysis trilogy overall and kind of ends the entire story of Crysis, as far as we know at least, because they're making a Crysis 4, but the story is just crazy convoluted, and it kind of just, by the end of it, just kind of feels unsatisfying because it comes to a conclusion so swiftly that it just doesn't feel all that satisfying. But really what you need to know rolling into Crysis 3 is that Prophet returns in one form or another. Whether that makes sense or not is besides the point, and his goal is to pretty much take down Cell due to the fact that they've pretty much taken over the world and control the entire power grid of the world with their System X. And as well, Prophet's goal is to take down the Alpha Ceph and prevent the end of humanity. Like I said, confusing story and kind of unsatisfyingly concludes the Crysis trilogy, but the story overall, I guess, is alright. It ends the Crysis trilogy, but it's just way too convoluted for my liking. Now, in terms of the characters, besides Psycho and Prophet, the characters don't really matter all that much in my opinion. There is no great antagonist from Cell, to be honest. Cell is just kind of a conglomerate that is just evil, and there is really no face to that evil. The Alpha Ceph doesn't have any personality. He's just a big bad alien that is trying to end the world. The other side characters honestly have some personality, but overall you really don't care for them. Psycho and Prophet are the main two characters, and they're really the two most enjoyable characters. Really, the best parts of Crysis 3 are when Psycho and Prophet have conflicts with each other, because it really makes Psycho point out the flaws of Prophet and point out if he's really human or not, because he points out the fact that the suit kind of overtakes Prophet and he questions whether he's truly human anymore or not, or whether the suit has taken over. And really those two characters play off each other really well. So Psycho and Prophet in terms of characters are actually really strong characters, and the voice actors help to bring out those strong characters overall, and really Prophet's overall narrative of kind of questioning where he's truly human or not is one of the stronger points of the story and the character arcs overall. But in terms of the story and characters, the two main characters are stronger overall than the story is at any given point. The story is way too convoluted for my liking, and it kind of just ends off the series with a kind of an unsatisfying ending, and as well it just feels way too rushed for its own good. But in terms of the gameplay, this is kind of where I have mixed opinions on the game overall. The setting this time around is a ruined version of New York City. This is kind of where the System X thing is. I mentioned during the story part, it's kind of in this weird biodome in this ruined and overgrown New York City. I would complain about the fact that the game is based again in New York City, but it's a really overgrown and kind of like taken by nature New York City that kind of takes on a different form than the New York City of Crysis 2, so I can't really complain that much because it really just does not feel like Crysis 2's New York City. It feels more like a forced kind of setting because it's like a ruined New York City mixed with like an overrun and overgrown New York City. So it's not a bad setting. I would say it's better and had more potential than Crysis 2 setting. It doesn't live up to expectation, but nonetheless it had more potential than Crysis 2 did for its setting. But with that being said, in terms of the map design, they do a bit better in this game than they do in Crysis 2 because they go for more open-ended map design. Now it's not completely open-ended and there is a decent amount of linearity here still, but they do go for a more open-ended approach to mission design, which is appreciable to say the least. There's also side missions in this game that they bring back as well. Some missions they give you a lot more freedom than other ones. I remember one mission where it just gives you so much freedom compared to the other missions in this game that it was actually pretty incredible, and I wish the entire game was like that because it kind of took after the original Crysis with doing a lot of open-ended shit and like a huge map that let you actually approach situations how you want to. Other than that, in the other missions they give you some ability to roam around and approach objectives how you want to, but they still keep that kind of linearity to the levels. But I would say that's an improvement overall in that department. The map design feels a lot better than it did in Crysis 2. I felt like Crysis 2 did have more personality in its maps, but in terms of the physics, they do a bit better in this game over Crysis 2 as well. It's not heavily noticeable, but they do have some foliage movement where enemies move through the foliage and the foliage moves, and when shooting through some trees, the branches will kind of shatter and fall off, as well as some brick walls will also fall apart when you shoot them. It's specific pieces of cover that are designed like that. It's not all walls and like all buildings, but they do better overall versus Crysis 2 in that department in this game. They just don't go as crazy as they did in Crysis 1. But in terms of the AI design, this game's AI is still as stupid as it has been in the previous two games. The AI just doesn't know what the hell to do, to be honest. When you go cloaked, you just absolutely disappear off the enemy's radar, and they just kind of don't know what to do. The AI wasn't very smart in Crysis 2, and it wasn't very smart in Crysis, and this time around I feel like I don't have a lot to talk about. The AI is just as dumb as it's been the previous two games. That goes for both Aliens and Cell. Just both of them aren't that smart. But in terms of the suit, since I feel like it has to be mentioned since it was in the previous two games, they really don't do a whole hell of a lot of crazy shit with the suit this time around. It's quite literally pretty much all the same shit from the previous two games. You can use a cloak to disguise yourself from the enemies and take a more stealthy approach to confrontations. They have an over armor where you can take more damage. You can still run and super jump like you could in the previous two games, and there is an upgrade system like there was in Crysis 2. It's just nothing all that crazy. I would say it's even less detailed than Crysis 2 in terms of upgrades. So the suit comes back and it still retains its function from the previous two Crysis games. I would say probably the biggest upgrade is the fact that the nano visor allows you to tag enemies and weapons this time around, which can be kind of useful. You can also hack turrets, but that's not something that's like crazy overused in this game. But the nano suit does return though, and it can be appreciated. But now in terms of the gunplay in some aspects in this game is actually better than the previous game, because this time around they actually make weapons kind of better in terms of the headshots, and really only in terms of headshots, to be honest, because when you get headshots the enemies drop a lot faster than they did in Crysis 2, so it makes it a lot more fun and satisfying in terms of the gunplay. The game does kind of lose Call of Duty soul in this game overall, but the gunplay still feels as tight and as fluid as it does in Crysis 2, which can be appreciated. That being said, it's still not crazy satisfying, to be honest, because enemies are still bullet sponges, and that's just really a complaint, to be honest, because unless you shoot human characters in the head, they still take a whole hell of a lot of bullets, like maybe half a magazine, 15 bullets. That's a lot of rounds to be taking, and it really just never got back to the point of satisfaction that you got in the original Crysis. Bullet sponging is just unsatisfying, and human characters do it, but as well the alien characters are just big bullet sponges, so that makes the gunplay feel unsatisfying at points. But overall, the gunplay still feels good in this game, and it feels like tight. It still feels kind of like Call of Duty though. A lot slower pace, I would say, in this game due to the more open-ended levels than the more linear levels in Crysis 2. And they do try to kind of break away from that Call of Duty syndrome that they had in the original game, but the gunplay still kind of feels like that. It's not a bad thing, like I said. Call of Duty has great gunplay, or at least the Call of Duty during that era had great gunplay, and so this game still has that kind of great gunplay overall. It has the same, like I said, satisfying gun sounds that make it feel good. I just wish there was less bullet sponging in this game because it would have been more satisfying overall. But I will say that I do like the parts where I'm shooting cell soldiers more than I do like shooting aliens because it feels more satisfying. Honestly, you feel like the Predator in Aliens vs. Predators when you play as Prophet fighting cell soldiers, because really you're just sneaking around and shooting cell soldiers while cloaked up, so you feel like you're more hunting people in that point, which makes it kind of have an interesting angle to the gameplay. But once you get to aliens, it just kind of falls apart with that, and the aliens are just a lot less satisfying. But I feel like mentioning with the gameplay overall, it does do better because you have more open-ended map design and you feel like you have more player independence to choose what you want to do. But the game is so short that the game never really hits its strides, and it just feels unsatisfying overall because it really never feels like the game actually comes to fruition. It feels so rushed that the ideas put in the game don't feel like they ever realize their full potential, and the game just kind of falls short in that aspect, to be honest. But in terms of the gameplay, it shows glimmers of hope of being better over Crysis 2, but it really never meets that potential. The gunplay still feels spongy, the open-ended map design is appreciated, but the game is so short and feels so rushed that the game never feels like it hits its full potential in gameplay overall. But in terms of Crysis 3, I feel like it was an unsatisfying way to end the trilogy overall. There are glimpses of potential in this game to be better than it actually was, but it just falls short because it feels rushed, to be honest. It just feels like it was a rushed game. It feels like it just never takes full advantage of the ideas that they put into the game. But overall, this is my least favorite game in the trilogy. My favorite game was the original Crysis, my second favorite game was Crysis 2, and my least favorite is Crysis 3. So overall, in terms of the series, it just went down over time. But overall, I'm glad that I did experience the Crysis trilogy. It's an experience I can say I had, and I wanted to have that experience back in the day with Crysis 2, but I mean, it was a good experience to have. I can recommend the original Crysis and Crysis 2. You'll end up playing Crysis 3 if you play the other two, but it's just kind of an unsatisfying experience. But thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see ya. Stay chill.